Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing the 2025 World Juniors, and more specifically, how the San Jose Sharks prospects performed at this tournament. San Jose sent 4 players, and we start off with the goaltender for Team Switzerland, Christian Kirsch. Now, Switzerland didn't exactly have many high expectations, unlike in the NHL, where there is a decent amount of parity even between the best and the worst teams. At the World Juniors, such a thing doesn't really exist. Many of those bottom-tier teams don't really have the talent to compete with the top of the ladder. Team USA against Team Switzerland, the States are probably going to win 99 times out of 100. And so, especially being the goaltender in that spot, you are kind of let out to dry. And so it's not that much of a surprise that the stats aren't particularly good here, and that his brief appearances against both the Americans and the Swedes were not very good. But in more fairer matchups, I guess, more closer to Switzerland's level, he was all right in his performance against Kazakhstan, who didn't really put up that much of a fight, but he was really good in his outing against Slovakia, which was quite nice to see. All in all, a decent enough tournament for this goaltending prospect. His future with the San Jose Sharks obviously remains in question, primarily because there is the big name in front of him, Askarov, who's only a few years older than him. So in 4 to 5 years' time, when Kirsch could perhaps be looking to make the jump to the NHL, Askarov should still be around with the Sharks and hopefully playing some good hockey. So it's going to be difficult to really make an impact with this franchise as a whole, but if he performs well over these next few years, maybe the Sharks can use him as a trading piece in the future. Then we move on to the prospect who actually won the entire tournament with Team USA, Brandon Svoboda. He wasn't brought in to be a big offensive weapon for this team. When you've got guys like Leonard, Perreault, Hagens, Connolly, Yzerman, you don't really need to step up in a huge way and bring a ton of offense to the table. He was brought in more so as a role player, play some good defensive hockey, be a reliable player that David Carl could send onto the ice and actually be trustworthy in those positions, which he exactly was. He got some shifts in a tie game late in the third period against Team Finland in that gold medal matchup, play on the penalty kill as well. But Svoboda didn't just do that, he actually chipped in offensively when he could. In the 7 games that Team USA played, he had 6 points, 3 goals, 3 assists for someone who only had about 11 minutes of ice time on average through these games. That is rather impressive. He even scored a huge goal in that gold medal game against Team Finland, the one that got the Americans back into it. They were down 3-1 through most of this second period, and then in those last couple of minutes, they grab the Svoboda goal. A lucky one for sure, not one that you're like super impressed by, but important nonetheless to allow them to finish off that comeback and eventually win it in overtime. So Svoboda, he played a big role on this team, not exactly a most prominent one. If you ask American fans or fans of hockey, they'll say, yeah, Leonard was so good and Perreault was so good and Buam and Hudson and all of these different players. But I'm sure if you ask the coaching staff what they thought about Svoboda's performance here at this tournament, they would sing his praises because he did play a really, really solid position. Now, does this alter the sort of outlook for him as a prospect? Not quite. You're still not thinking he's going to have any sort of top 6 potential, but if you would ask me a few weeks ago what I believed about Svoboda as a prospect in the Sharks system, I would say he was not a very notable name, but now he could be someone who could make an impact for the Sharks in a bottom 6 position. It won't be for another 2 to 3 years as he finishes his time at college, but someone to keep an eye on within the Sharks system for sure. Then we move on to maybe a higher tier prospect for the Sharks coming into it. On Team Finland, we do have Kasper Halttunen. There were some expectations for this player coming into it. This was his second time appearing on Team Finland at the World Juniors. He had an A on his chest. He was supposed to fill a big role, and while I certainly won't sit here and say Halttunen was bad, it does feel as though there was a little bit of a missed opportunity, especially with how far Finland went into this tournament, getting to that gold medal game. You were probably hoping that Halttunen could be a bigger name player for this team. But right now, when you think of Team Finland, you think of their goaltender Rimpinen, you think of Konsta Helenius, you think of Kiskinen, who was their goal-scoring leader. Halttunen is a bit further down that list, maybe like their 5th or 6th best player, which is fine, but a little bit less than one would have hoped. In the 7 games he played, he only managed to grab the 1 goal. Considering he's a goal scorer, that's not great to go with 3 assists and 4 points. But I guess his general level of play throughout this tournament certainly wasn't too bad. His first couple of games, it was a slow start, especially that first one against Team Canada. All of Finland was not very good in that game. But his 2 outings against Team USA I thought were quite good. That first matchup in the round robin, a very impressive one that Finland even won in that particular case. The gold medal game, while he didn't finish that game off particularly well, his first period was very impressive. He was actually the player of the game, which is a semi-notable achievement in the previous one against Team Sweden in the semifinals. So I thought he did do still some good things on the ice. It's just that I think the ceiling was a little bit higher, the expectations were a little bit higher, and it was just kind of a middling performance. It doesn't hurt his stock as a Sharks prospect, but I don't think it really helps it out either. Finally, we move on to the big name prospect here at this tournament, Sam Dickinson with Team Canada. And this is who is going to cover really the brunt of this video, and that's because of just how important Dickinson is within the Sharks system. No offense to the 3 previous players, but if Svoboda doesn't end up working out for San Jose, being that former 3rd-round pick, is that really a huge deal? Not quite. Same goes with Kirsch, and while Halttunen is definitely further up in the depth chart than either of those 2 players, it's still not the end of the world if he never quite pans out as an NHL player. But currently, Sam Dickinson is the Sharks' #1 defensive prospect, and unless they managed to draft Matthew Schaefer this year at the 2025 draft, that is likely a title that he will keep. And if the Sharks, as Mike Grier likely is, are hoping to try and have a quick turnaround over these next few seasons in their rebuild, Dickinson is going to need to play a very big role and hopefully pan out to be a top pairing defenseman. And the hype coming into this tournament was at an all-time high for him. He was not only the defensive leading scorer in the OHL, the most points amongst all defensemen, he was actually 3rd in terms of points per game amongst all OHL players in general, including the forwards. And that culminated into this great achievement of making it onto the Team Canada roster in the first place, above guys who were actually drafted from his position above him at the 2024 draft, like Zane Parik and Carter Yakimchuk. And so there was a lot of excitement to see what he could do on the big stage for a team that is usually a perennial favorite to win the gold medal. And as we know, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this here, Dickinson was quite bad at this tournament. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Dickinson did not have a particularly good performance. His first couple of games, he was limited in the role that he was actually able to play. But once Matthew Schaefer got injured against Team Latvia, he stepped into a much bigger role for this squad, and he did not actually live up to the potential. There were some pretty disastrous outings for him, some good moments still. You don't want to completely eliminate the good things he did at this tournament. In the 5 games, he had 2 assists. I guess that's something. But, the big thing that stands out especially is that quarterfinal game against Czechia. That first period, he was probably the worst player on the ice, or at least amongst them, for Team Canada, making tons of defensive errors, giveaways, and also just getting a little bit of bad luck with some bad bounces on one of those Czechia goals. So generally, you're not super impressed with what Dickinson was able to do at this tournament. And the big thing that stood out in a bad way was the major thing that also stood out back in the offseason when we watched Dickinson perform at the Rookie Faceoff tournament and in the Sharks preseason, which was simply his decision-making with the puck, in particular in the defensive zone. He's just hasn't seemingly made many strides in that particular area over these last few months with the London Knights. One has to wonder if perhaps the London Knights are just so good that Dickinson is never put into that many frequent positions where he has to be smart with the puck in his own zone. And even when he does make those types of mistakes, he's able to outscore those errors where it doesn't actually reflect all that poorly on him. Right now, just a couple of weeks ago, I floated the idea that perhaps Sam Dickinson can have a Will Smith level of approach taken with him next year, since Dickinson is not eligible to play with the San Jose Barracuda next season because he is too young, that the Sharks could do a Kevin Korchinski type of situation, have him play up in the NHL, ease him into these games, give him sheltered minutes, not too much, 3rd pairing time at least at the start of the season to see how he adjusts to that. But right now, watching this appearance, which admittedly is a small sample size of just 5 games, it doesn't feel as though, unless he makes huge strides in his game over the next 9 months, that he would even be able to handle those types of sheltered minutes at the NHL level. There are just too many errors, too many mistakes in his game currently. And so the general outlook here, though it is still early, is that he would end up going back to juniors for the 25-26 season, finish out the year with the London Knights there, then make the jump to the professional level in 26-27. But he might still need the time and the seasoning with the San Jose Barracuda that year, which means he might only be looking to make a true NHL debut in 27-28. Now, it should be noted that this is not the end of the world for defensive prospects. While most forwards are able to make the jump, at least high up drafted forwards are able to make that jump within a year or two, defensemen can take a little bit longer. They have more responsibility on their shoulders. They need to fill out a bit more physically, just mature physically in general. And so they could take 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 years. So it's not as though Dickinson would be that far out of this path. But as I mentioned earlier on, if Mike Grier is looking for a little bit of a quick turnaround out of this rebuild, Dickinson might not be a part of that right away, which is a bit of a disappointment. On top of that, we also look across the aisle there at Team USA, who was absolutely dominant throughout much of this tournament. They win the gold medal in that final game against Team Finland, and we got to see Buam play a massive role. Once again, he was a big part of their 2024 win last year. He was again a huge part of their 2025 win. Watching him dominate the ice when he was on offensively was very much something, and he was also the leader amongst time on ice players in that final gold medal game by a pretty significant margin on both teams. That's how much trust he had from his coaching staff. It's a little bit influenced by the fact that David Carl has Buam back in the NCAA with Denver, so obviously he's going to have more trust in him to be actually a strong player compared to the other guys, but still, Buam did a very, very good job. And the reason I bring this up is not just completely out of the blue, but because Buam was drafted 12th overall by the Minnesota Wild in 2024, one spot below the Sharks taking Dickinson. At that position at number 11, it was basically a 50-50 call. We knew the Sharks were leaning defense. It was either Dickinson or Buam. Many Sharks fans wanted them to take Buam, and he ends up going, Grier does, with the kind of safer and more physically developed, with greater size option with Dickinson. And this tournament, it does need to be said, it's not the end-all be-all. This is not going to be it wouldn't be the first time where a player has a bad World Juniors tournament and then goes on to have a very successful NHL career either. We're not going to be drawing any sort of conclusions from it, but it certainly doesn't help to watch what just happened here. It kind of rubs the salt in the wound a little bit. Having said all that, in Dickinson's favor, what does need to be mentioned is that while the Team USA was sort of a well-oiled machine here at this tournament, Team Canada was anything but. They were actually extremely dysfunctional and one of the worst teams that Canada has had in a very, very long time, from top to bottom. It started off with the poor selection for this team. You again look at the Americans, the amount of firepower that they had when they needed to score a goal, when they needed to generate offensive zone time. They can send out Higgins with Perreault and Leonard, have Buam and Hudson on the back end, and that's going to be as best of a 5-man unit as you're going to get at this year's tournament. Team Canada, you could argue that they did bring some game breakers and they simply just didn't live up to the potential, but there were a lot of huge names that they left on the table and they left at home. Guys like Beckett Seneca, Michael Misa, Andrew Cristal on the back end, Zane Parik and Carter Yakimchuk. There were some very, very big names that Team Canada just simply did not bother bringing. And even when Matthew Schaefer got injured and they had the opportunity to get somebody in there, they refused to do so. They were stubborn enough to stick with the players that they brought in the first place. And clearly this didn't end up working out. Having said that, even with a perhaps subpar roster, this is still a very talented Team Canada unit that maybe doesn't have the possibility of beating Team America in the gold medal victory, but should still be competitive for a medal at this tournament instead of bowing out in the quarterfinals like they did. And so the next thing here is that the coaching staff for Team Canada was absolutely horrible. I do not understand what Dave Cameron was doing most of the time here. His deployments simply did not make much sense for a team that was searching for offense. There were multiple players who could have brought that higher level level of play who were actually benched or played as a 13th forward, only given a few minutes of time on ice. That didn't make much sense. Then, of course, you have the power play debacle that started off at this tournament, where you bring in someone like Sam Dickinson, who is the #1 power play quarterback in the entire OHL, really, for the London Knights. But instead of having him quarterback your power play, you have Oliver Bonk, who is on the London Knights as well and doesn't play in that position. And this is the direction that they took through the first 2 games of this tournament. That just made absolutely zero sense. And by the time the Latvia game ended, that seemed to be really the nail in the coffin for Team Canada confidence-wise. They never quite recovered from that, even when they made the adjustment further down the line. So it was just a weird start to the tournament. And then, of course, we have some of the quotes that Dave Cameron came out with saying based on some of the undisciplined play that Canada showed, but also the fact that they weren't skating a lot. And the reason for Cameron from that was that they were fatigued, even though every single team is playing 4 games in 7 days. This is not an entirely new schedule. The fact that Team Canada is being viewed as these tired players while everybody else is doing, seemingly as far as I know, is practicing and is skating, that just doesn't really make as much sense as you would think, especially when you consider the fact that for many of these players who might not be able to ever actually make a huge impact in the NHL, this World Juniors tournament is the most important sort of high pressure, big stage of their entire hockey careers. This is really the end-all be-all. If you're going to be a little bit tired, you work through that like we saw every other team do. And this lack of practice, we can see, very much led to the majority of the issues that the Team Canada players had. The thing is that this was not a team. This was just a group of individuals playing on their own and playing for themselves. And sure, at a World Juniors, since you're bringing in so many players from a bunch of different teams, from a bunch of different leagues, you're not expecting the Harlem Globetrotters on the ice, but you are expecting a certain amount of trust and cohesion to be there, and we could see that with the Americans, but not just with those #1 guys. Even just look at a team like Team Latvia. These are players from all these different places, even different countries from around the world, who have come together to play under their flag, and they were greater than the sum of their parts. Nobody thought Latvia would be a true contender for a medal here. Many people even put them likely in that relegation game, but they surprised everybody with the impressive effort that they put out with that victory against Team Canada. And it's because they were willing to play for each other. They were willing to trust each other on the ice, something that Canada absolutely did nothing of. And that's exactly what led to the real big problem, which was their lack of discipline. Canada gave up primarily all power play goals here in terms of their goals against. I believe 7 of the 10 that they gave up at this tournament were power play goals. And it's not because their penalty kill was absolutely horrible. It was actually clipping at over 70%, which isn't great, but it's not terrible either. It's because they ended up shorthanded, I believe, 27 times over just 5 games. And it's because these players, because they're not trusting their teammates, are trying to do a little bit too much. They feel as though if their guy gets past them, they're going to get a great chance. They don't trust that their teammate can have their back, and so they'll slash and they'll trip and they'll hook and they'll interfere with these guys and try to prevent those opportunities. So it really does come down to the coaching staff, the horrific approach that they took with all of these players. And so there is blame at every possible angle for this Team Canada team. So to really bring it back to Dickinson, yes, he did not have a good tournament at all. He was definitely a pretty bad player here for this team, but nobody on Team Canada was actually all that great. You can kind of split hairs and say, well, this guy had an okay tournament, but at the end of the day, of the leading scorers for Team Canada in 5 games, the top scorer for them had just 3 points. That is not remotely good enough, especially for a roster that historically has been very impressive. So generally, it was a complete disaster for Team Canada as a whole, and it might be a little bit unfair to single out Sam Dickinson when the environment was clearly toxic here. Anyhow, when it comes to the Sharks in general at this World Juniors, probably a little bit of a disappointment. You know, you were really mostly keeping an eye on Dickinson and things did not go particularly well there. And Halttunen, I wouldn't say was so amazingly impressive. So generally, a little bit of a forgettable tournament for sure for Sharks fans. Class dismissed.